Cambodia. I now give the floor to His Excellency Walid Al-Moualem, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Expatriates of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Excellency Mr. Tijani Mohammed Bandi, President of the 74th Session of the United Nations General Assembly. Allow me to congratulate you on your election as President of the current session of the General Assembly. I wish you every success in the future. I would also like to thank your predecessor for her important role as President of the previous session. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, we meet today at a moment when the picture might look bleak globally. The foundations of global political, economic, legal, and security relations are facing their greatest threat since the establishment of our organization. Conflicts and threats to international peace and security are on the rise. The prospects of war far exceed those of peace. The fate of a balanced global economy has become uncertain. Violations of international conventions and treaties have become the norm, while the unbridled use of illegal measures under international law, such as supporting terrorism and imposing economic embargoes, have gotten out of hand. All of this only creates chaos across the world, gradually replacing the rule of law with the law of the jungle. It jeopardizes the future of our countries and forces our people to pay the ultimate price, to sacrifice their security, their stability, their well-being, and their lives. We stand today at a crossroads. Are we going to work in good faith to build a more secure, stable, and just world? A world free of terrorism, occupation, and hegemony. A world based on international law, a culture of dialogue and mutual understanding? Or are we going to stand idly by, despite everything, leaving the future of our people and the future generations hanging in the balance and flouting the principles and goals set forth by the founding fathers of our organization? This is the question that you, ladies and gentlemen, must answer. Mr. President, terrorism remains one of the main threats to international peace and security, and a danger to all without exception. Despite the extraordinary achievements that we have made in Syria, thanks to the sacrifices and heroism of the Syrian Arab Army and the support of our allies and friends, our people have suffered for more than 8 years from the scourge of terrorists who have slaughtered innocent people, who have caused a humanitarian crisis, who have destroyed our infrastructure and plundered the country. History will forever remember the heroism of Syrians in their war against terrorism. Syrians defended not only themselves, their country and their culture, but they also defended humanity as a whole. They defended civilized values and the culture of tolerance and coexistence. They defended those values against extremism and against the ideology of hatred and death that terrorist groups such as ISIL, Al-Nusra Front, and their sponsors and supporters were trying to spread. We are determined to continue our war against terrorism in all its forms until we root out the last remaining terrorist. In addition, we will take every necessary measure to avoid its resurgence. However, putting an end to this global nightmare, which haunts everyone, requires a genuine international will. To achieve this, we will not be reinventing the wheel. We already have multiple legal instruments, such as Security Council resolutions, and some resolutions were adopted under Chapter 7. They focus on fighting terrorism and drying up its funding and resources. The problem is that these resolutions remain dead letter. Unfortunately, countering terrorism has yet to become a priority for certain countries that remain deathly silent in the face of brutal terrorism facing countries like my own. While some countries merely issue empty statements, some actually invest in terrorism, using it as a tool to impose their insidious agendas on the people and governments that reject their external diktats and insist on making their own decisions. The case of Syria has been the clearest example of such foreign investment in terrorism. Tens of thousands of foreign terrorist fighters have been brought to Syria from more than 100 countries with the support and cover of states that are known to all. Even more, these same states deny us the right to defend our people against terrorists, which they consider freedom fighters or Syrian armed opposition, as some like to call them. However, it has slipped their minds that if they continue with their approach, terrorism will re-emerge stronger than ever before and will threaten everyone without exception, including its supporters and those who have funded it. Ladies and gentlemen, the most recent example is the situation in Idlib in Syria. It is known to all that Idlib currently hosts the largest gathering of foreign terrorist fighters in the world, and this according to the reports of specialized Security Council committees themselves. The time I have been allotted today is not enough to list all the crimes that these terrorists have committed. However, I must mention their continued rocket and mortar attacks against civilian areas close to Idlib and their use of civilians in Idlib as human shields, preventing those civilians from leaving through the Abu Duhur humanitarian corridor, which the Syrian government has opened. The question is, would one of your governments stand and watch if faced with a similar situation? Would you ever forfeit your right and duty to defend your people and liberate your country from terrorists and foreigners? The Syrian government has engaged in political initiatives to solve the situation in Idlib. We have given them more than enough time to be implemented. We have welcomed the memorandum creating the de-escalation zones and the Sochi Agreement on Idlib, hoping that such steps would complement efforts to eliminate Al-Nusra Front and ISIL remnants and other terrorist groups operating in Idlib with the lowest possible loss of civilian lives. We have also announced more than once the suspension of military operations. Meanwhile, during that time, the Turkish regime has failed to fulfill its commitments under these agreements. Instead, it has provided terrorists with all forms of support, including weapons that are more sophisticated. Al-Qaeda-affiliated Al-Nusra Front has taken control of 90% of Idlib, and the Turkish observation points established inside Syria have been used to support these terrorists and block the advances of the Syrian army in its war against them. The Turkish regime is now rushing, with the support of some Western countries, to protect Al-Nusra Front and other terrorist groups there, just as they have done before. Can you imagine, ladies and gentlemen, that a country would directly intervene to protect the Al-Qaeda-affiliated Al-Nusra Front, the same terrorist group that the Security Council resolution itself considers a threat not only to Syria but also to international peace and security? Mr. President, the United States and Turkey maintain an illegal military presence in northern Syria. They have been so arrogant to the point of holding discussions and reaching agreements on the creation of a so-called safe zone inside Syria, as if they were planning to establish this zone on American or Turkish soil. This is a violation of international law and the UN Charter. Any agreement about any part of Syria without the consent of the Syrian government is condemned and rejected in form and in substance. Any foreign forces operating in our territories without our authorization are occupying forces and must withdraw immediately. Should they refuse, we have the right to take any and all countermeasures authorized under international law. In this regard, I would like to refer quickly to the terrorist, criminal, and oppressive practices implemented by the cessationist militias known as SDF against Syrians in the governorates of Hasaka, Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, and Aleppo. With the support of the United States and coalition forces, they seek to impose a new reality that serves American and Israeli agendas in the region, a reality that prolongs the war terrorists are waging against Syria. Mr. President, Turkey's policies, whether in Idlib or in northern Syria, and its political maneuvers may undermine all the achievements made in Astana. Turkey cannot claim to uphold Syria's unity and territorial integrity, while at the same time it is the first to undermine them. If Turkey is truly committed to the security of its borders and the unity of Syria, as it claims, It must choose whether to respect the Astana understandings and the bilateral agreements on counterterrorism, to secure the borders and to withdraw its forces from Syria, or to be the aggressor and the occupier, and to face the consequences. The safety of the borders of one country cannot come at the expense of the security, sovereignty, or territorial integrity of neighboring countries. Mr. President, along with our fight against terrorism, we have been committed to moving the political process forward. We are participating in the Astana meetings, which are proving effective, and we welcome the outcomes of the Syrian National Dialogue Congress in Sochi, including the convening of a committee to discuss the constitution. To that end, we have engaged seriously and constructively with the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria to form this committee. Indeed, it was the determination of Syria to establish the Constitutional Committee under the persistence follow-up of each minute detailed by President Bashar al-Assad. This led to this important national development for the Syrian people and thwarted any attempt of an obstruction by some parties that have consistently stalled and continue to stall, placing their bets on terrorists and foreign forces and imposing preconditions to prevent any return to normalcy in Syria. During his last visit to Damascus, we reached an agreement with the Special Envoy Mr. Geir Pedersen on the terms of reference and rules of procedure of this committee, including a number of principles related to the work of the committee. These include: 1. The whole process should be owned and led by Syrians themselves, who have the exclusive right of determining their country's future without any foreign intervention or interference. 2. There must be no prejudice whatsoever to the strong commitment of upholding fully the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. 3. No preconditions must be imposed on the committee, nor should its recommendations be prejudged. The committee must be independent. Its recommendations must be made independently, without interference by any country or party, such as the so-called small group that has declared itself the guardian of the Syrian people and has already prejudged the outcome of the committee's work. 4. No deadlines or timetables must be imposed on the committee. Each step taken must be prudent and informed, since the Constitution is the essential step in the determination of Syria's future. Although we remain committed to making progress, such progress must be on firm footing to meet the aspirations of Syrians. 5. The Special Envoy for Syria must play the role of a facilitator, using his good offices as necessary to bridge differences. With these principles in mind, we reaffirm our readiness to engage and work actively with friendly countries and the Special Envoy to launch the work of this committee. Mr. President, simultaneously, Syria is making tremendous efforts to improve the humanitarian situation on the ground and rebuild what the terrorists have destroyed. significant progress has been made despite the illegal and inhumane economic blockade that some countries have imposed on our people. This blockade has restricted access to medical equipment, medicine, oil products necessary for electricity, household gas, and heating fuel. The United States has even threatened companies participating in the Damascus International Fair in order to stifle any economic activity in Syria. Failing to achieve their goals through armed terrorism, these countries have resorted to economic terrorism, an equally brutal form of terrorism, imposing a blockade and unilateral coercive economic measures. Therefore, we call on all peace-loving countries that uphold international law to come together and adopt effective measures to counter this phenomenon, which is not only used against Syria, but has also become a weapon of political and economic blackmail against many other countries. From this rostrum, we call once again for the lifting of such illegal measures imposed on Syrians and on all other independent people, in particular the people of Iran, Venezuela, the DPRK, Cuba, and Belarus, and we stand with China and Russia in the face of the unjust American policies. We have made it clear on several occasions that the doors are open for the voluntary and safe return of all Syrian refugees to their homeland. To that end, the Syrian government is providing the necessary facilities, rebuilding and rehabilitating the public infrastructure in areas liberated from terrorists. However, Western and some countries of destination for refugees continue to obstruct such initiatives. Indeed, we have noticed a strange change in the position of these countries. Instead of using every opportunity to call for the immediate return of refugees to Syria, as they had always done, these countries are now imposing artificial conditions to prevent such returns, using this purely humanitarian issue as leverage to serve their political agendas. This is truly reminiscent of the theater of the absurd. What is happening, however, is no laughing matter. It is a manipulation of the fate of nations and a cheap exploitation of their suffering. Mr. President, instead of working towards peace and stability in the region, Israel has started yet another phase of escalation, heightening regional tensions to unprecedented levels. Israel did not only occupy Arab territories, including the Syrian Golan, it also continues to violate international humanitarian and human rights laws, and it continues to support terrorism on a daily basis. It has even launched repeated attacks on Syrian territories and on the territories of neighboring countries under false pretexts, in flagrant violation of international law, the UN Charter, and relevant Security Council resolutions. These Israeli violations would not continue and escalate were it not for the blind support of certain countries that are fully responsible for the consequences of Israel's action. Such support became horrifically evident when the United States decided to recognize Israel's alleged and false sovereignty over the occupied Syrian Golan, recognize the occupied city of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and relocate its embassy to Jerusalem, not to mention the intensive U.S. efforts to undermine the Palestinian cause. All of these decisions are null and void and represent a complete disregard to international legitimacy. Some must understand that the era of the acquisition of land by force has long passed. It is a delusion to think that the crisis in Syria would force us to forfeit our inalienable right to recover the Golan fully to the borders of June 4, 1967, by using all possible measures under international law. Moreover, it is a delusion to think that the decisions of the U.S. administration on the sovereignty over the Golan would alter historical and geographical facts or the provisions of international law. The Golan has been and will forever be part of Syria. Israel must be compelled to implement relevant United Nations resolutions, notably Resolution 497 on the occupied Syrian Golan, and to cease its repeated attacks on the countries of the region, as well as its settlement activities. Israel must be compelled to allow the Palestinian people to establish their own independent state with Jerusalem as its capital along the borders of June 4, 1967, and ensure the return of Palestinian refugees to their homes. Mr. President, Syria expresses once again its full solidarity with the Islamic Republic of Iran in the face of the irresponsible American measures. In particular, the U.S. withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action between Iran, the P5+1, and the European Union. We warn against policies that aim to foment crises and conflicts in the Gulf under false pretexts. We believe that the security and stability of the Gulf can only be achieved through cooperation and dialogue among the countries of that region without any external interference that might increase escalation in the region and run counter to the interests of the people of the Gulf. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I stress that Syria, supported by its allies and friends, has stood firm in the face of externally supported organized terrorism that targeted Syria, its people, and its culture. Today, we are ushering in a new era that will bring us closer to our final victory. We aspire to a bright and safe future for our people after the long suffering. We are conscious that the various challenges and difficulties that we are facing today or will face in the future are as intractable as the phenomenon of terrorism. However, we are determined to overcome them just the same. We have always had the best relations with other countries. We have never sought to antagonize anyone. Today, our hand is extended for peace. We continue to promote dialogue and mutual understanding, and while staying true to our national principles, which we will never betray. Obviously, there are governments that have offended Syria and its people. Nevertheless, we will never hold a grudge or seek revenge. We will engage with others, keeping in mind the interests of our country and our people, in line with our desire to achieve peace, stability, and prosperity in Syria and the region. In exchange, those countries that have antagonized Syria must reconsider their positions and correct any miscalculations. They must let go of their delusions and resort to realism and common sense for the common good. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Expatriates of the Syrian Arab Republic for his statement.